Hey everybody, welcome back to another one here. This time we're going to be talking about the East before 1800 or so. How your book's going to describe that, how we're going to talk about it today. We're mostly talking China and Japan, Korea in there a little bit too, but we won't talk about it too much. And then other places that we think of as Asian, like Southeast Asia, India, stuff like that, we'll kind of save for next time. So this time we'll mostly be focusing on China and Japan up to about 1800, and this is often thought of as a period that's sort of not quite pre-modern, not quite modern, it's something else in between. So we'll look at the Qing and Ming dynasties, we'll talk about Tokugawa Japan, and then we'll talk a little bit about East Asia in relationship to their neighbors or in relationship to other Afro-Europeans and get a sense of how they were connected sort of across the continent, how they're tying in to the early Columbian exchange, stuff like that. So during the early modern period, this period that's sort of, around the same time we've been looking at, maybe 1500 to 1800, the Ming and Qing dynasties are going to sort of reassert themselves as Chinese. And this comes with a more sort of conservative bend and a re-emphasis on what it means to be Chinese after kind of a longer period when they were controlled by the Mongols, who were seen as sort of a foreign empire. So, uh, if you know about like Genghis Khan and the rise of the Mongols and stuff like this, either from the first half of world history, if you took that, or just general knowledge and stuff, when the Mongols take over China, they form a new empire there, the Yuan dynasty. You can see it on the left here, it's in green, and it's a big part of modern day China, Tibet, part of the Koreas, Mongolia, right, and up into what today is Russia. They rule over China, but they're never quite seen as legitimate local rulers. They're always seen as sort of Mongols from the outside who are ruling over some sort of legitimate China. Then in 1368, there's been a number of problems for the Mongol Empire around Afro-Eurasia, not just in China. And it's sort of falling apart a little bit. There's going to be a revolution, and there's going to be a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty. There it is on the right, sort of showing its shape, where you get Chinese people who see themselves as authentically Chinese back in power, expelling the Mongol barbarians from the region. So the Ming dynasty is going to have a pretty conservative ideology, and this has nothing to do with like left-right politics in the US or anything like that. So more what it means is because there had been this sort of foreign leadership for so long, when the Ming come to power, they're going to promote like authentic Chineseness. They're going to try to show how Chinese they are, and they're going to have a certain fear or anxiety about foreigners, although not all the time. They are going to do some stuff like explore the oceans around Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, but by and large, they're going to be slightly more isolationist. They're going to want to reinvest in like authentic Chinese culture, looking to the past for what was great. During this time, they're going to become a silver sink for the world. And what does that mean? Well, in your book, it talks about this a little bit, but basically, we're going to come to see that the Ming Dynasty sort of sees itself as having everything it wants. It has tons of people, tons of food, it makes all this great stuff, tea, porcelain, all these things that other people want. The only thing it really wants in terms of foreign trade is silver, because they're going to use their money in silver and they're going to tax people in silver. So what this map is showing is the sort of routes. We talked a little bit about the Spanish coming to the Americas, the Portuguese coming to the Americas, and one of the things the Spanish are going to find is big mines of silver in what today is Mexico and Peru. That silver is going to mostly get shipped over to the Philippines, and then from there it's going to get shipped to China, and it's going to be used to buy a bunch of stuff in China. So the Chinese don't want European goods, but they do want that silver, since they use it for their currency. So in exchange, we're going to see lots and lots of commercialization going on in China. The mass production of products for sale, domestic and foreign, things like tea, silk, porcelain, all kinds of new cash crops, and some of these were from the Columbian Exchange, right? So wheat had been there before, millet had been there before, but now you're going to get things like potatoes all of a sudden and corn, right? And Chinese, particularly in southern China, can produce tons of this stuff, turns into a great sort of cash crop product. Um, Here you go. Here's some of the coins, right, that the Ming Dynasty is printing, their own currency, often in silver. This is an example of Ming porcelain. You might have heard of like a Ming vase or something like that. That's blue and white color. A lot of European porcelain tries to copy this later, but they don't quite get it right. It takes them a long time. So until then, they're going to want to buy this stuff from China. Also, with all of this sort of new money and mass commercialization, you start to get all kinds of things that we recognize as sort of modern economic examples of people in the middle class almost, or like spending money, things like tourism, things like popular culture, consumption, fashion. Here's some different sort of fashion, right, from the Ming Dynasty. So people are starting to have more money in some ways to be able to have at least a little disposable income on these sorts of things. It's a pretty great time actually in China. It's sort of a revitalization of authentic Chinese stuff. But no dynasty can last forever. The Ming Dynasty is going to be facing a lot of problems by the mid 1600s. Mostly those have to do with the taxation schemes. They're still getting pressure from the north, all these sorts of things. So the Ming Dynasty is going to be on the verge of collapse by about 1650, something like this. But you pretty quickly get a new dynasty with the Qing. So during the 1630s, there's lots of these peasant rebellions against the Ming government, and it's a sort of opportune moment. There's another group of people from the north. They call themselves the Manchus. They're not quite Chinese. They're not Mongolians. They're just like a slightly different ethnic group. They're known for being horse riders and archers and stuff like this. Here's a nice picture of a Manchu horse rider. But they also have some new stuff that wasn't really available before, guns and cannons. So the Chinese had invented gunpowder a while ago, but it was mostly used for explosive devices, fireworks, entertainment, siege weapons. It hadn't really been turned into guns and gunpowder yet, but the Mongols take this technology, they refine it a little bit, they take it, they use it in their attacks against Europe's armies. European armies are going to see this stuff, particularly like the French and the Germans. They're going to make guns, they're going to love them. The same thing is going to be true in the gunpowder empires that we'll look at next time, the Islamic sort of empires. They've got different names. We'll get to how that's all problematic next time. But these are going to come back to China. So the Qing, the Manchus are going to build their empire with guns. And they still have these great horse riding skills, but if you have a gun instead of bow and arrow, right, might help you a lot. But more importantly, they're going to have cannons, which allow you to defeat other armies quite easily. They're going to capture Beijing, 1644. That's the capital of the Ming Dynasty. It's in northern China, right? If you've seen images and stuff like that, right? Yeah, you know, Beijing's still the capital. Here's some of the Qing Dynasty with cannons, sort of early cannons, right? So that allows you to scare other armies, that allows you to sort of take out forces more quickly, engage in siege warfare, all these sorts of things. One of the things that was really unique about the Qing Empire was the Manchu people had this sort of system, they called it the banner system. And basically, when going into war, there were different sort of groups, different banners that might be what your armor and clothing was colored like, but it was also a way to sort of categorize military units and who owed loyalty to who sort of under the state. The Qing are going to keep that intact when they start to form their governments. So here you go, here's like the 8 sort of banners. These are large groups of sort of distinct, almost clans, but they're still sort of united. that are going to fight and be deployed in different places. The Qing had some great ideas about how to mobilize lots and lots of people. If you can get them to all be loyal to one sort of banner, right, but then that banner is loyal to the system overall, you can encourage a lot of local participation. Um, the Qing are, like the Mongols before them, a little bit ethnically different from the rest of the Chinese. They have their own spoken language, they're going to have their own written language. They have a lot of sort of ethnic markers and cultural markers that are really important to them: horse riding, wrestling tournaments, a certain hairstyle, and they are going to keep all of this stuff. But as they start to take over China, they realize that what happened to the Mongols was the Mongols refused to like put on a Chinese face basically in terms of politics. So the Manchus are going to keep like their cultural identity, their ethnic identity, but they also want to use all of that Ming bureaucracy, all of the sort of Chinese traditions. They want to invoke Confucianism. And in order to do this, they're going to double down on those Ming conservative policies. So this is kind of funky because here you have like this outside northern force coming in, taking over China, but then instantly proclaiming they're like more Chinese than the Chinese. And they want to encourage people to feel as Chinese as possible, to participate in Chinese tradition and culture, and really try to invoke the sense in the state that this is like an authentic government of Chinese people for Chinese people, which the Mongolians had never really managed to do. Here you go. Here is the sort of map of the expansive Qing dynasty. You can see that sort of pink area. Here, hold on a second. Up here, right, is kind of where the Manchus originally come from. They kind of spread out. They take over this Ming state, and then they're going to expand into some new areas out further afield for the Chinese. And this is going to sort of shape the way that the Chinese state looks today in a lot of ways. So what was it like living under the Qing now that we have this new sort of foreign rulers who are becoming Chinese and who are trying to make everything Chinese? Well, they're going to keep their capital at Beijing. This is the same place it is today, right, in northern China, kind of close enough to the ocean, but not right on it. This is a classic Chinese emperor here. He's Qing Emperor Kangxi, but he's also Manchu. But in this painting, he's depicting himself as like super Chinese, which makes a lot of sense. If you take over, you might want to depict yourself as like one of the people or like one of the cultural or ethnic group that you're trying to manage, because it tells them, hey man, I'm one of you, I'm authentic, I'm supposed to be here, right? Don't worry about it. It's a lot more convincing if you depict yourself in this way. He's one of the more famous Qing rulers. He was very intelligent and very engaged with sort of Chinese culture, and the expansion of the empire under him is really incredible, these sorts of things. So over about 100 years, the Qing come to be seen as totally legitimate rulers. People see them as just a normal ruling class. They're seen as Chinese. They're seen as being part of the system. It's totally okay. And they start to then make changes to what it means to be Chinese overall. There still going to be a lot of conflicts. The Qing's originally sort of a garrison state. They have to send soldiers to put down rebellions, all these sorts of things. But over time, that's going to kind of go away. One of the things that the Qings do that's really interesting is they mandate that all males in the empire, in the sort of, larger kingdom of China, have to wear the queue. It's a certain hairstyle that was popular among the Manchus. Here's a photo of it. Obviously, since this was a photo, this was taken later, but it's the same sort of hairstyle, right? Where most of the head is shaved, and then you have sort of a long ponytail sort of tied thing in the back. Why would you make citizens do this or subjects do this? If it's the sort of Manchu thing to do, why would you want everybody doing it? It sort of implies a cultural power, right, over everybody else. It sort of shows the dominance of the particular culture. The Manchu want to use their culture in a certain way. They want to keep some of it for themselves, but they also want to project it onto the people. During this time, you also start to get new clothing styles that are a mix. So here you have middle class and elite women, right, in China. This is obviously, again, from a little bit later, but it shows the same style, where there's mixtures of like um, Manchu fashion, Chinese, like older Ming Dynasty fashion. These women are wearing what's called a qi pao, which comes to be seen as like a classic Chinese dress. This isn't quite it. It still needs to be modified a little bit. But they have like Manchu hats, but like Chinese clothing. It's all mixing. It's kind of becoming the same thing. Also, during the Qing, economic activity is stepped up in terms of foreign trade, but it's still going to be tightly controlled by the state. And one of the things that the Chinese start to trade the most is tea. Here's some nice gunpowder green tea. It becomes a huge trading commodity. This is the tea that's going to be traded with the British in the Boston Tea Party, right? In the US, everybody thinks that this like bags of like black tea getting thrown in the ocean. Nah, it was like boxes of this stuff, right? This green tea is what the British were drinking in the Americas, all these sorts of things. Also during this time is when you see the Great Wall sort of coming to fruition and being its final form. The Mongols and others had invaded from the north. The Manchus had come from the north. There had been like these long series of walls that had begun during the Qing dynasty. They're thousands of years old, but they're in poor shape. They're falling apart. They never really stretched and connected all over. But during the late Ming and the early Qing dynasties, they're going to repair these things. They're going to make these huge and recognizable as to what they are today. Here's a little section of the wall at Badling, which is like north of Beijing. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers building these giant structures. They go through like hilly mountains. They go to the coast. They go through deserts. It's crazy. It's at least 1,500 miles long. It's maybe 30 feet high at the lowest in some places, maybe 50 feet high in other places where there's big sort of garrison buildings. You may have heard you can see it from space. That's not true, but it is huge. It is still one of the biggest like human structures on the planet. Um, it's really incredible if you get a chance to go. Yeah. So, despite the Ming and Qing being fairly conservative and sort of looking to the past to tell them what China was and what China should be, there's a lot of changes going on during this time, during this sort of pre-modern era. And one way you can kind of look at that is with the incredible sort of increase in population. So if you look at the population of China around 1500, there's about 100 million people, which is huge for the world at that time. But if you look 100 years later, there's 60 million more people. So the population goes up about 60% in 100 years. It's just a giant boom in terms of the amount of people. And that leads to a lot more urbanization, a lot more sort of economic opportunities, more densely packed living conditions, the need to make agriculture more successful, all these sorts of things. You have bigger armies, right, with this many people. So just the massive increase in population alone explains a whole lot of change. You also see a new sort of system of gender relations with these new sort of more conservative politics. That gets kind of tied up to what it means to be female, and this happens in lots of different places. Typically, when societies become a little bit more conservative or inward looking, the role of women becomes sort of more domesticated because ultimately it's sort of women that are responsible for raising the children and having the next generation and keeping the culture authentic or true to the past, something like this. So during this time in China, You see a lot of sort of repression of women, the expansion of foot binding, which was originally an elite practice, and everybody always wants to see stuff like this. So here you go, here's the nice little shoe, right, that Ming and Qing women would wear. The idea was to make the foot sort of as small as possible. That's what was beautiful. There you go, there's an actual foot in a shoe. Uh, so the way you do this is when kids are pretty young, when these girls are pretty young, you break a bone in the foot and you sort of relocate it and sort of move it together and you bind it, and over time the foot will kind of take a different shape, right? It kind of heals in a different shape. These are more modern photos, obviously, but there are still some people in China that have this. It's extremely rare now. People haven't been doing foot binding since the Communist Revolution and all these sorts of things. So there's only like a few old people left that have this, but there are some people who are still around, so you can see it. But what was the point of this? Well, if you have originally, right, it was an elite phenomenon. If you have like little teeny feet that make it so it's hard to walk, you clearly aren't out in the fields working, right? It sort of shows that your women are like so spoiled, they don't have to work and all these sorts of things. It's the same as long fingernails. If you've ever thought, why do women have long fingernails, right? Well, originally it was to show that you don't work in the mud, you don't have a hard life, you can like sit around and grow out your fingernails. And then it became sort of more of like a common culture or like a practice for middle and low class folks. But the same thing is true in China. It starts out as this elite phenomenon and sort of trickles down culturally to where even farming communities are doing this. But that's actually really tough because if you do this to young women that are going to grow up to be farmers, it really hurts them. It makes it difficult for them to do the job that inevitably they have to do right on the farm. Everybody has to pitch in. So it's pretty constraining for women in a lot of ways. On the flip side, during this time, you get really funky new ideas about independent women and romantic love and all this sort of stuff developing that's like a glimmer of almost not like women's liberation or anything like that, but you get also a more sort of refined role for women where there's different possibilities and different places for them to move. It's really interesting. Also, you see the beginnings of what we might call like pop culture. Early novels, right, circulate during this time. So well before there's novels circulating in Europe, there are little books circulating all over China. A lot of them are like detective stories and ghost stories kind of mixed together, or sort of fables. And people love this sort of stuff. There's a pretty high literacy rate. Maybe 40 or 50% of men can read. Lots of women could read, although it wasn't as high of a percentage. So this really sort of binds people together, and you start to get a sort of common knowledge. Whenever there's sort of a mass publication, right, and lots of people can read the same things, they start to bond in certain ways. If we've all read the same book, we can kind of talk about it. We have ideas based on it. So you start to see that during this time in the late Ming, early Qing. But there's this massive economy, but some people have argued that these sort of conservative philosophies, this idea that you should look to the past for greatness, actually made China less inventive during this time. A lot of that is kind of bogus. People want to say, look, during this time there's all these revolutions in Europe and all these changes. Why didn't that happen in China? That's just not the way it works. You can't be like, oh, person A did this thing, person B didn't, so person B is like behind or something. It doesn't really make sense. There was a ton of innovation in China during this time. It's just not along the same lines necessarily as what was happening in Europe. And so some people sort of choose to be like, ah, look, see, this conservative culture didn't allow for change, but there was lots of change going on. You see tons of commodification, tons of economic opportunities, tons of new ways of understanding the world. And so, it's these conservative politics and sort of philosophies do have an effect on some things, but they don't prevent change per se. So what about Japan? What's going on over in Japan during the same time? This is the first sort of time you start to have a Japan that's recognizable as one thing. You're going to get a sort of broader state. Japan's a bunch of different islands. It's had a bunch of different governments and all kinds of situations. It was never really unified before the Tokugawa era. So in the sort of early modern, maybe 1450 to 1600, Japan, archipelago, right, is just a fancy word for a bunch of islands. Japan hadn't had a single government. Instead, they had these big, large districts. They had an emperor. They had shoguns, which are just a military general, that had all been engaging in various forms of civil war for a few hundred years. It wasn't one like connected state, and even previously, when it had been one connected state, it didn't cover the whole thing we think of today. So that's all going to change in the mid 1500s. Tokugawa Ieyasu is going to start to make moves with his friends that'll eventually lead to the Tokugawa Empire. So it's named after him, right? Or the Tokugawa Shogunate, to be more specific. So in 1600, Tokugawa is going to manage to end all of these various civil wars. Here he is, Ieyasu, Tokugawa Ieyasu, right? You can say it. That's more the Japanese way is to say the first name last, right? All that sort of stuff. So he's really the last of three generals that all sort of set out to end this civil war and sort of conquer all of Japan for one sort of unified state. The other two are dead. Tokugawa is still there, and he's going to benefit from their efforts and form one connected government that controls the entire string of islands that we think of as Japan. So one way that he was able to do this was he had guns. It's going to be kind of a theme, right? And we're going to see this next time from the Portuguese. This was a new technology that allowed the samurai to be even more deadly. It allowed for Tokugawa to have armies that could shoot cannons at castles and things like this, that really allowed him to break sieges and get rid of these other military leaders that were in his way. So when he eventually comes to power, he creates a new government that comes to be called the Bakufu. This is in Edo, right? Which Edo is the early name for the city you know now as like Tokyo. Bakufu means tent government, right? And the idea was this was a military government. It was on the move in tents. But Edo is actually going to become a really big city. Here you have sort of like a picture of these sort of early Tokugawa leaders all sitting around. It's not like in a tent like roughing it or anything later on. So once Tokugawa is in power, the idea is to make one strong state that will just have peace. Japan's been at civil war and various conflicts for about 150 years. So the idea is let's find a way to sort of, through repression, through force, through whatever, make Japan just steady. That's going to require laws, that's going to require military, all kinds of things. But the idea being, look, everyone's just tired of war. Let's have a state that's just committed to peace. So in order to do this, Tokugawa figures out he has to control the daimyo. The daimyo are just other lords with a lot of land and their own militaries. If you want to think in terms of like European stuff, this is often compared to like kings and vassals or kings and knights. So you have like daimyo they own their own giant chunk of land, they have a castle, they have all of their own warriors, they have their own money. So how do you have a state with a bunch of these different groups that have this stuff, that have their own power bases? Well, what he thought was you can leave them pretty independent. As long as you find a way to make them less powerful over time, you'll be able to sort of pull them into the state. So he has a couple of really interesting ideas about how to do this. The first idea, in 1635, you get the system of alternating attendance. And what this means is every year, the daimyo have to switch back and forth where they live, right? They have to alternate where they're living. One year, They can live in their home province at their home castle. The next year they have to live in Edo with the shogun. Not necessarily with the shogun, but in the same city. So what this means is the daimyo are never fully at home. They're never fully in the capital. They're kind of moving back and forth. And these are like rich, powerful elites. So when they move, they can't just like, walk or something. There were no cars or anything yet. So you need like a big parade of soldiers. You need to be carried in really fancy wagons. You need to bring food, horses, money. If your province is far away, you might be on the road for a few weeks. So this builds up a whole new type of economy. You have all of these new roads, you have inns, state commerce, banking, right? If you're going to transport 2,000 guys, you might want to have a bank somewhere in the city where you have money so you can pay them later, all these sorts of things. Some of these roads are still around, right? These are original routes that would have gone through small towns. Now you need sort of places for all these people to stay along the way. So what was this for, right? Well, one thing is you just bleed them of cash. So if the daimyo have to go back and forth every year, and these are really important people and they're going to spend a lot of money, you ensure that they're continuously spending money on other parts of the economy and sort of moving it out of their grasp into the state more generally. Also, when they're in the city, you can keep an eye on them. Maybe their families stay in the city, right? There's sort of a mild hostage situation. They're unlikely to maybe attack the capital if their family's living there, stuff like that. Another neat trick that the shogun comes up with, that Tokugawa comes up with, and his sort of the other shoguns that come after him, is they're going to control who the daimyos can marry and who they can meet with in certain ways. So they can't just meet with the emperor, they can't just meet with each other, and they can't marry each other necessarily. So why would you want to do this? Well, if there's two really powerful houses, you probably don't want them to marry together, because then there'd be like one super powerful house, right? They might even be more powerful than the state generally. So the idea would be you want to sort of weaken them over time. You don't want them to form like stronger marriage alliances. For the same reason you don't want them to like meet up and conspire, right? Maybe against the broader state, maybe against the shogunate. You want them to be relatively isolated from each other. That makes them easier to manage, right? Here you go. Here's some daimyo on the move, staying in inns. That's kind of nice, right? So during this time, totally coincidentally, right, just like an accident of history, Japan is temporarily going to get much richer. So remember, China is like sucking up all this silver. A lot of it's coming from Mexico and Peru, right, with the Spanish. But they're also going to get a bunch of that silver from Japan. So as the civil wars are sort of dying down, a bunch of new silver mines are developed in Japan, and they just happen to be a prolific source of silver. So the Japanese are going to take this silver and transport it to China and exchange it for all of the cool stuff coming out of China. So it's a really big period of economic growth because all of this new silver is going to allow them to get Chinese art, books, porcelain, tea, silk, right? This is going to allow the Japanese culture to really benefit from the commercial products of China, right, in exchange for the silver. Some of that's going to be done sort of at the government level, a lot of it's going to be done at the local level, but you start to get a relatively economically booming place. All kinds of new sort of objects of daily living, different lacquerware, different screens, right? The material for making books, the material for making clothes. You get a real sort of commercialization of the economy based on these Chinese products. And you get a lot of sort of prestige because at the time, Chinese stuff was like cool and exciting. So the fact that the Japanese could have these sorts of things meant they were sort of doing well, right? Here's a nice painting of a street scene going on. You can sort of tell the economic success. You have all of these big houses, they look cool, there's lots of people on the streets. In this particular rendition, the streets are literally made from gold, right? That wouldn't have been true, but it sure makes things look pretty awesome, right? So it's a really successful sort of economic time, and in a little bit I'll show you the sort of size of Tokyo is just expanding really rapidly. So what's going to happen though to Japanese culture? So if you're hip to this sort of stuff, you might know a lot about the samurai, or you might sort of see them as the sort of warrior class. Well, strangely, the samurai that were so active during the civil wars and that are like really representative of Japan don't have a great time now. So after about 1615, when Tokugawa really solidifies his empire, there's not another major military action for about 250 years. So what happens to the samurai when they don't go to war? You have all of these people whose whole sort of livelihood is supposed to be super professional soldier, super skilled warrior. But when you have peace for decade after decade after decade, generation after generation after generation, what happens to these sort of warrior class? They don't really have anything to do. So this is when you get this sort of mystic version of the samurai, these samurai that are like in really fancy dress and have really elaborate stuff, and it's very artistic. This is when you have samurai sort of shown as engaging in all these sort of worldly pleasures, because they're not going off to war, right? But strangely, this is also when you start to get a lot more of the development of sort of martial arts and sort of sword play. So the main weapon for the samurai was not swords, it was bows and arrows. But after this time, you start to see more sort of focus on the sword and individual combat, dueling, but that's only because it's not really happening very much. It sort of becomes a religious thing or a sort of honor code. This idea is called Bushido, right? Like the way of the warrior. But it's not because these people were fighting, it was actually the complete opposite. It was because they weren't fighting, right? So this warrior class, they're supposed to train to be great warriors, but they're not really going to war. So you get a emphasis on the sort of spiritual side, the artistic side, the sort of skill of war rather than the actual practice of it. And in a lot of ways, the samurai become a class that's not economically productive. They don't farm. They don't really do very much, right? They're supposed to be warriors. Maybe 7% of the population. So what do instead? Well, sort of slowly over time, they become bankers. They become merchants. They become people who loan out money. They become sort of bureaucratic officials. A lot of them, the vast majority, keep like the record books. They become accountants basically for the big houses, or they become guards, or they become sort of civil servants. So even though they're trained to be warriors and they wear swords, and theoretically they are, most of the samurai have never actually seen combat and do things like keep track of the rice count, for the house and stuff like this. So you can tell maybe something bad might be going on there. Another thing that keeps the samurai really busy is the new sort of culture in the city. So Edo, remember, is the big city. And in Edo, you get this new phenomenon, the floating world, Yukio. So Edo is growing in importance. There's lots and lots of middle class and elites there. Maybe a quarter of the population is samurai, right? You have all these people, the daimyo and everything, coming from other places to the city. So the middle class and elites, they have all this free time. They start to engage in all kinds of artistic activities and entertainment activities. And one of the main entertainment quarters is called Yoshiwara. It's like a red light district. It's got everything. It's got prostitution, dancing, gambling, all the newest restaurants, but also bookshops, art, new tea houses, bathhouses, sort of everything you can imagine, right? So it has things like this that are like really elaborate tea houses where you go and you drink tea. Um, inside, they're, as a really unique style of aesthetic, made to sort of connect to that philosophical like way of the warrior that's developing a little bit, but also just like a sense of what it means to be Japanese and samurai and these sorts of things, elite. Um, you start to get things like this, right? These are street scenes, things like postcards, prints of the city, small scale artwork. You may have seen things like this before, right? Pictures from the city. um, these actually become really influential on European art. So a lot of impressionist painters in Europe are going to basically take these ideas and use them. So there's all kinds of new stuff going on. This printed material, but there's also new theater, romance novels, all kinds of stuff. I'll show you a couple things. I'll show you a little example of kabuki and a little example of bunraku. Kabuki is a type of theater. The samurai weren't necessarily supposed to go to the theater. It was seen as like undisciplined, but they did anyway because it was really cool. Bunraku is like puppet theater. I'll show you what that is too. It's a very unique sort of Japanese thing. Here's some little clips.
Kabuki is a Japanese traditional theatre form which originated in the Edo period at the beginning of the 17th century and was particularly popular among townspeople. After 1868, when Japan opened up to Western influences, actors strove to heighten the reputation of kabuki among the upper classes and to adapt the traditional styles to modern tastes. Today, kabuki is the most popular of the traditional styles of Japanese drama. Important characteristics of kabuki theatre include its particular music, costumes, stage devices and props, as well as specific plays, language and acting styles, such as the miyu, in which the actor holds a characteristic pose to establish his character. Originally, both men and women acted in kabuki plays, but eventually only male actors performed the plays, a tradition that has remained to the present day. Male actors who specialize in women's roles are called onagata. Two other major role types are aragoto, rough style, and wagoto, soft style. The actors speak in a monotone voice and are accompanied by traditional instruments. Kabuki plays are about historical events and moral conflict in affairs of the heart. The kabuki stage is equipped with several devices, such as revolving stages and trapdoors, through which the actors may appear and disappear. Another speciality of the kabuki stage is a footbridge, hanamichi, that extends into the audience. Keshi, the special makeup, provides an element of style that is easily recognizable, even by those unfamiliar with the art form. Ranking along with No and Kabuki as one of Japan's foremost traditional stage arts, the Ningyo Jorori Bunraku puppet theatre is a blend of sung narrative, instrumental accompaniment and puppet drama. This theatrical form emerged during the early Edo period, around 1600, when puppetry was coupled with Jorori, a popular 15th century narrative genre. In the mid-17th century, numerous permanent commercial theatres were devoted specifically to puppet performances and kabuki, and by the mid-18th century, Ningyo Jorori had adopted its characteristic staging style. The genre acquired its present full name, Ningyo Jorori Bunraku, in the late 19th century. The Bunrakuza was a leading theatre of the period. The stories told in Ningyo Jorori, as this new form of puppet theatre was known at the time, derived from two principal sources: historical plays set in feudal times, jidaimono, and contemporary dramas that explored the conflict between affairs of the heart and social obligations, syuwamono. The impressive puppets, which are dressed in elaborate costumes and have individualized facial expressions, are painstakingly handcrafted by master puppet makers. Three puppeteers, who are visible to the audience, manipulate large articulated puppets on a stage behind a waist-high screen. From a projecting elevated platform, yuka, the narrator, Tayu, recounts the action, while a musician provides accompaniment on a three-string spike lute, shamisen. The Tayu portrays all of the characters, both male and female, and assumes different voices and intonations to suit each role and situation. Although the Tayu reads from a scripted text, there is ample room for improvisation. The three puppeteers must carefully coordinate their movements to ensure that the puppet's gestures and attitudes appear realistic.
A single puppeteer style later developed into the present three-puppeteer style in the 18th century, giving rise to a unique performance style seen nowhere else in the world. The main puppeteer, or omozukai, operates the body and head with his left hand and the puppet's right hand with his own right hand. The second puppeteer, or hidari-zukai, matching the movements of the main puppeteer, operates the doll's left hand. The third puppeteer, or ashi-zukai, operates the doll's feet with both hands. When the three puppeteers work in perfect synchronization, the puppets magically come to life. Since female dolls, as a rule, have no feet, the third puppeteer must hold the hem of the kimono and use his hands and arms to create the illusion of moving legs.
So you can see from those clips, like, just a really funky new types of art, new types of music, clothing, design, masks, that were all kind of growing in popularity because there was this new urban center, right? These new movements. And that's really connected to the idea just in general. Like in China, the population is just exploding. So between 1600 and 1700, for example, the population goes from about 22 million to about 29 million. So why was this happening? That's an incredible increase, right, in 100 years. There's a lot of new agricultural and economic processes. The Japanese, like all societies, were continuing to develop, the use of fertilizers, the use of crop rotation, machinery, really, really basic machinery like spinning wheels and stuff like that, for agricultural process. So you get more food. When you get more food, you can have more people. When you have more people, you tend to get more urbanization. So you start to get more sort of castle towns, medium-sized cities. But in places like Edo is a huge city with over 1 million Japanese people living there. It was one of the biggest cities in the world. And life in the sort of urban environments is going to become really structured and highly stratified. So here's a print sort of depicting Edo a little bit later. But there's a sort of whole culture of commerce, of public space, of art kind of going on. People are out, people are busy, people are doing things. And this comes in large part because of that long-term peace. Most people know sort of in this really structured social system who they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to do, and that leads towards a lot of stability. This allows for the really easy functioning of markets and public spaces, and creates a very coherent sense of what it means, sort of beginning to be, of what it means to be Japanese, right? Whereas previously people wouldn't have necessarily thought of themselves this way, you start to see that sort of coming together during this time. So what about East Asia and its neighbors? We know that Europeans are kind of all over the world during this time. Surely they were showing up in China and Japan. What was that like? Well, the first thing to think about is during this time, states in East Asia are mostly controlling their own affairs, and they're not beholden to Europeans. They're not getting colonized. They're not getting taken over. At least China and Japan are going to remain independent and really strong during this period. But there are Europeans that make it over into China. The earliest wave, of course, is going to be Christians that are part of the sort of Jesuit community. We talked about that a couple times ago. These new sort of Catholics societies that want to go and do missionary work and spread to various places. In particular, this guy, Matteo Ricci, who's somewhat famous, you might know, makes it to China pretty early on. He's one of the founding members of the Jesuits, and he has this idea for really expanding around the world. He gets to Macau, which is a Portuguese colony, like a little chunk of city in the bottom of southern China. It's near Hong Kong, and he starts to promote Christianity. He starts to connect to the Chinese people. As you can see, he wears Chinese clothes. He learns Chinese. because he feels like that's the way to do it. If you just show up and try to be European in China, it's not going to work. If you sort of become Chinese, then you'll have an easier time spreading the message of Christianity. And he gets to be an important figure in China. He meets with the emperor. He goes up to the Forbidden City in Beijing. That's like the big capital where the emperor lives. But overall, the Chinese government is not really interested in Christianity. They're not really interested in Europeans. They're not really interested in the Jesuits for that matter at all. Except they like that the Jesuits are interested in science and technology. So the emperor is interested in things like clocks, astronomy, geography, geology, languages, things like this that the Chinese might be able to use. But in terms of Christianity, they don't do very well. The Jesuits never get a ton of converts, and it's not seen as like a major moment for Christianity in China yet. Other places you see more trade-based. For example, in Taiwan, here's a map that's spelled a little bit different, but still Taiwan, right? The Dutch land, and the idea is they're going to be able to get all those Chinese goods. China's going to take them down to the island right below it, the sort of commerce there. Then the Dutch are going to take it from there back to Europe. So you get some sort of commercial trade that way outside of China, but still Chinese material, not too much. The Qing dynasty, though, is going to be a lot less friendly towards foreigners and trade. So remember when the Qing come in, they're going to like double down on all of those conservative edicts and sort of laws from the Ming, and they start to see some Europeans showing up in the South, some people converting to Christianity, and they see this as sort of threatening, right? They see all these new Southern barbarians, they call them, coming in and demanding things. The Qing are still going to want European silver, right? They're still going to want to be connected to the global economy, and they're going to want to keep selling tea, and they're going to want to, engaging in trade, but they don't want missionary activity. The emperor, one of the early emperors of the Qing dynasty, is actually going to make it illegal, right, for missionary activity. So after that time, you don't get a lot of it in China. There's some of that porcelain, right, that the Dutch were looking for in Taiwan. But this is not to say that foreign trade gets cut off or anything like this. It's just going to be really tightly controlled by the state. Remember, the government has that really conservative ideology, and typically in China, you always had danger from the north, right? So the Mongols came down into China, the Manchu came down into China, barbarians had always been up here. But these new southern barbarians kind of confused the Chinese. They showed up in boats that hadn't really been a thing before, and they wanted to trade, but they also had cannons and other weapons. So what the Qing government is going to do is regulate trade to trading quarters. So in this area that's now just north of Hong Kong, called Guangzhou, they're going to set up these sort of trading forts that they call factories, right? It's one of the places where the word comes from, where European traders are going to be allowed to show up and trade their goods for Chinese material. The Chinese materials are going to be brought from all over the empire down to this city. Then foreigners can come to the city and then they can trade there and go home. And again, the main thing that Europeans bring to the table at this point is silver. The Chinese don't want a lot of other European products. But we're going to see in the future, the British in particular start going to importing another product that's going to be popular in China, although not popular with the government, opium. So we'll see that coming a little bit later. Here you go. The way it works is Europeans show up and they have to work through the various hongs, which are like trade organizations there in southern China. So they show up, they have their products, they exchange everything right there. The Europeans don't go into China, they don't go to the actual markets, they just go to these exchange sites. At the same time, a lot of Chinese folks are going overseas to Southeast Asia. There's a big sort of out-migration. A lot of young Chinese want to go make their future elsewhere. So they go to places like today, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, stuff like this, looking for trade opportunities, looking to find new resources, all these sorts of things. So this is when you get that big connection between China and Southeast Asia that's still there today. If you go to Southeast Asia, there's large sort of overseas Chinese communities, and that starts during this time, and there was a little bit earlier, but mostly during this time. What about foreign influence in Japan? Well, the Tokugawa Shogunate is motivated by a lot of those same conservative ideas as in China. Remember, they had had lots of civil war for a long time, and even though Tokugawa got some help sort of from Europeans in the form of guns, afterwards they don't necessarily want Europeans coming in and making any changes, particularly when the Europeans start to spread Christianity or try to control trade. The Japanese are going to get upset and just expel all of them, except for the Dutch. Because the Dutch were mostly just interested in small amounts of trade, and they didn't proselytize or try to spread Christianity. The Japanese thought, okay, they're fine. In particular, there was one city, Nagasaki, where all the Dutch were sent. There was sort of an island off the coast, a little bit like not very far, where they built all the factories. The Dutch could sail to that island. They could do all of their trading for Japanese goods and go home, essentially. But there was still some contact between the Dutch and the Japanese. This led to a phenomenon called Dutch learning. The Japanese wanted to read about what was going on around the rest of the world. The Dutch had books about sort of the new transformations in Europe, the new sciences coming out of Europe. They had books about the Americas, and the Japanese wanted all of these things. So there is exchange there. Also, Japan continued to trade with China, the Koreas. I mean, it was just Korea at the time, but those areas, and the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is going to become Okinawa later, right? Sort of under the Japanese. Also, even though it was illegal, a lot of Japanese folks traveled to Southeast Asia, many of them for sex work, or many of them for to be involved in sort of mining operations. Also, a lot of them as pirates, sort of trying to pick off Chinese trade or European trade. So there was a lot of stuff going on. Sometimes people overemphasize that Japan was isolated during this time. That's not really true. They were connected in all kinds of various ways to the outside world. One of the interesting sort of ways you can look at this is through Christianity in Japan. You see that same sort of connection and then severance that you do with European relations broadly or with Christianity in China. But it's a little bit more quick and severe in Japan. So in 1549, Francis Xavier arrives in Japan and has a lot of success early on. He's another one of these Jesuit missionaries who hopes to spread Christianity by learning about the local culture, learning the local language, translating the Bible, sort of getting in with local people, and he's successful. Within, less than maybe 50 years or so, there's tons of Christians in a certain area of Japan, maybe as many as 300,000. So here's an early depiction of the Portuguese arriving in Japan. You'll notice their clothes are really funky. They're bringing a dog. Also, they appear to have a slave with them, stuff like that, right? So the Japanese were sort of getting some observations about the Portuguese during this time. But here you have the sort of missionary activities, right, depicted, and a lot of samurai showing up to listen to what the Christians had to say. But with any sort of new religion or new conversion or foreigners coming in and bringing something that really appeals to people, you can often have a backlash against these things. So as the Tokugawa Shogunate was trying to really shore up its political strength, at the same time, there were groups of foreigners with a new religion that claimed that your only like true allegiance had to be with God, but as it turns out, the Europeans kind of owned God, right? In that Christianity was coming from Europe, the Pope was in Europe, you were supposed to listen to the Pope, so there was sort of like another king over here somewhere, and the Japanese didn't really like that, the Japanese government. So they passed edicts and laws forbidding proselytizing, and actually turn rather violent. Many Christians are persecuted and, in fact, get crucified during this time as a way to sort of convince people to stop converting to what's seen as a strange sort of foreign religion that's anti-Japanese in sort of opinion of the leadership. After this happens, Christianity is not really a big factor in Japan anymore. Um, Later on, we're going to see some of the sort of modernizing Japanese are Christian, and that is important, but sometimes that role is overstated. If you go to Japan today, very few people are Christian. The tradition that seemed like it was kind of successful for a minute didn't really happen. So, all right, so we looked at the sort of early modern period, the Ming and Qing dynasties, as well as the Tokugawa Shogunate. They are trying to create long-term political stability, right? They're coming from a place of war, or they're coming from sort of foreign leadership, and they want sort of basic structured societies. But a lot of new stuff is happening as well. When we see them again, what's going to be happening is these structured societies are going to be coming into contact with Europeans who are trying to colonize them, and guns, and the sort of new global economy and stuff. So we'll see how these societies that are aiming for peace and sort of long-term stability based on traditional or conservative models looking to the past are going to then hold up when confronted with more modern ideologies. So we'll check on that in a bit. Next time, though, we're going to take a look at these so-called Islamic empires. These are sometimes called gunpowder empires. Your book does a pretty good job talking about how neither of these terms is really that great, and what the problems are with these terms, but we'll kind of leave it and we'll talk with that next time. So get on that reading, and as always, let me know if you have any questions. Go ahead and email me. Otherwise, see you again soon.